Hey, thanks for showing up on a beautiful day. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about trains and model railroads and how to combine the two. And this particular video that you're seeing here is what inspired my Port of Los Angeles layout. And by the way, could you guys hear the sound of the engines there? Did you hear that? Okay, well, anyway. All right, so this is the outline of the talk that we're going to follow. First question we want to ask is, why do you want to have ships on a model railroad? And once we address that, we'll move on to various examples, prototype examples of how trains and ships interact. And I'll go through a bunch of them here. And then finally, we'll get into how to build some ships for model railroads, and then show you a gallery of people that have built some really nice ship models in conjunction with their railroad. Okay, so first question is, why ships? And a couple of years ago, when Paul Dolkus built his port layout, he had this great big open area between two piers. And I said, Paul, you should put a ship in there. And he said, I'm a model railroader. I'm not a ship modeler. And I said, oh, okay, whatever. But I like to do everything. And I think there's a lot of reasons why you might want to have a ship on a railroad. So one of the first reasons is it's probably the oldest form of modeling, maybe surpassed by figure modeling. I was at a museum in Los Angeles, the Getty Museum, and they had examples of small figurines that Romans had been sculpting. So those were thousands of years old, but they were also ship models from that era. So it's probably the oldest form of modeling. And they are fascinating models. Look at this scene right here, where you have an old tramp steamer and railroad cars right up next to it, loading from the railroad car right into the ship. And some people think, well, ship models are really tough. And I will hopefully show you later that they're really not that hard to build, particularly because we're looking at waterline models where we cut away most of the complicated parts of the ship. And that makes them not much different from any other model railroad structure. And if the structure is, well, it's too big, I don't want to build a big ship like that. Well, people have no compunctions about building other large industries like steel mills or paper mills, and a ship can be an interesting structure just like those. Here you see break bulk cargo being loaded. Basically, a ship is a team track. You could put pretty much anything on a ship, especially these old freighters. Later, as we go on in the future, the ships become a little more specialized. So they provide some interesting operations, which is my last point down there. They also are scenic highlights of railroads. If you have a well-built ship model, it will definitely be one of the highlights of your railroad. And the ships, particularly in O scale that I work in these days, they can act as view blocks, so that instead of having to have a big mountain, you could just put a ship there and it helps break up the scene. So lots of good reasons to put a ship on a model railroad. And they really go together like soup and sandwich or a beer and pretzel. So before we get talking too much about the models, I wanted to throw some charts up that show the importance of maritime traffic to U.S. transportation. And this chart is from 2017, and it shows how you have riverine traffic here. And this is, the rail is green. These are the Coal River trains, and the red are trucks. So trucks are the predominant cargo carrier, but ships do a lot too. And this doesn't show our Great Lakes cargo or our seaborne cargo. So there was a lot of transport by ship. In this 1920, you'll see how the iron ore moved by tonnage. These lines, by the way, are proportional. The width is proportional to the amount of tonnage. And so you can see 300,000 tons a year was moving along the Great Lakes. Also, the old steel mill at Sparrows Point was getting shipped iron ore from Chile and some other locations too. And the Mississippi River right now, if you go back to this chart here, you'll see that the fattest line on this chart is the Mississippi River. And so that is the single most important freight artery in the United States. And this is a picture near New Orleans that shows some of the freight traffic going on down there. And if in the background here, you see a unit train going to come into this grain elevator. But these ships, each one of these ships, especially the bigger ones, are carrying 3 or 4, 5 unit trains worth of grain, and these barges, I'll talk a little bit more about these later, also carrying unit trains worth of grain. So you're looking at, in this one picture here, probably 20 trains worth of cargo. And another thing I was curious about, and it was a little trouble finding this data, was the value of the freight that we're hauling. And if you look at this, you'll see that trucks transport in general the most valuable freight, not counting air traffic because it's fairly small. Air traffic gets the most expensive. Pharmaceuticals, very expensive electronics, they go by air. But trucks get the next highest. And then water is slightly higher than trains, which I was somewhat interested, surprised actually to find out about that. And pipelines are important too. So this puts the rail industry in 2017 in perspective. Also, if we had gone back, say the 50s, the truck and the rail would flip-flop, and water would actually go up more too. We had a lot of cargo that shipped by US port to US port. That's not as common as it used to be because of trucks and rail. And here we see the ton miles going back to 2020. I would love to get this chart to go back all the way to the 1910s, but I haven't been able to find that data yet. So we see that trucks are dominating now, although there was a point where trucks and rail overlapped in about 2013, about 2012, and pipeline water has been going down slightly. So let's look at the first examples of early marine interface. And this one is actually a picture I took of my old switching layout, but it illustrates the earliest rail marine, which is just bring up the tracks alongside a riverbank and put things in barges. And here we see a picture from the C&O Canal up in Cumberland, where they were loading these old coal hoppers directly into barges. Interestingly enough, these things were actually pulled onto the pier by donkeys. And then these barges would come down to C&O Canal, so that's the Potomac River over there. They would come down the C&O Canal, and if there ever was a scene worth modeling, it would be this one. You've got this interesting crane with gondolas and barges transloading cargo, and you even have lumber over there. That's up by Williamsport. And then you get to Alexandria, and they would unload coal at the waterfront. And this is the old locomotive factory that used to be in Alexandria. This is a model I built for the Lyceum, which is still on exhibit there if you ever want to go see it. There were other canals like this all over the United States where you had a rail marine interface. Up here in Phillipsburg, coal barges. Now we get into break bulk cargo. So break bulk is the predominant form of cargo up until the dawn of containerization. And break bulk is just loose cargo being loaded on ships in barrels, crates, and here you see them loading bananas, or I should say unloading bananas, off of this ship and onto this Fruitcar Express. This is New Orleans in like the 1920s. And this continues up until the diesel era, although this picture was taken in China. You see break bulk cargo being loaded on a relatively modern ship in the 1950s. There are no trains in this picture, unfortunately. But there were plenty of examples in the United States of this going on. Here we have pier sheds on the Southern Railway in Mobile, Alabama. And one of the things I like about this picture is the juxtaposition of steam and sail along with the trains. This is something I find personally fascinating. It's one of the reasons I'm modeling the Civil Wars. We have steamships and sailing ships in my era. The pier sheds make interesting structures. There are basically two forms. You have the rails along the apron, or you have the rails inside, and then the ships come alongside without tracks. And it just depends on how you're going to do it. For model railroads, this is better because you get to see the trains and you can uncouple them and do things like that. Whereas here, this was probably just as common and is more efficient probably for the railroad's perspective. This pier, by the way, these pictures were taken by Paul Dolkus. This is all gone now. This is up in Baltimore. And during World War II, you had a lot of switching that went on along these piers. This is a classic advertisement from the Pennsy, and it shows wartime convoys being loaded and the operations to get this stuff loaded from rail to ship was very convoluted. You actually had a ship master or a load master who told the trains the sequence they would go up to be unloaded, so that the heavier equipment or ammo or whatever needed to go on the bottom would go on the bottom, and the lighter things would go on top. And so the switching was very intricate. So it would make a very interesting layout and an interesting scene to model. And these cranes on the ships are evolving. This is what the modern ones, the contemporary ones, look like. The old T-sheet, or not T-sheet, Hebrew and those other companies that made traveling cranes, those are kind of being phased out in favor of these ones. And you'll also see that the mobile crane at the port side, at least, is starting to take over. And there are models of these available. I have this one and this one in HO scale. And modern break bulk involves moving cargoes like this because of containerization. A lot of the smaller cargo moves by container, but there's still break bulk cargo and moving transformers, moving windmill parts. Upper right here, you see a reactor for a chemical plant. These are windmill parts that are being loaded. That's what break bulk has evolved to now. And this is a nice little example of a port or a pier that does primarily break bulk, and that would be the Harbor Island facility here. It does commercial, but it does a lot of military cargo too. And then next to it is a gravel terminal. Across the creek is a steel mill, and there's a big grain elevator down here. And if you like military cargoes, this would be a good one because this is where the U.S. Army sends most of the tanks that are in Texas and other locations. So they will rail them to Beaumont and put them on ships for deployment. And I like this shot here because it shows a complex track work. And here you see an auto carrier that is being rigged up to haul military cargo. Grain terminals are another example where we have ships and trains come together. This is the model of Alexandria that I mentioned earlier. You can see how this works. The barges or the ships come in, the marine leg will unload them. It'll go up this elevator, drop down, flow into there, go up into the top, and then be distributed to the various bins and then exported by rail, or it could be exported back by ship. So here you see the train coming in. There's a grain elevator. And what we see in this picture is the ship, the sailing ship, is being unloaded through the marine leg here, but simultaneously they are loading this barge. So that's pretty sophisticated stuff for an early steam era. This is another intermodal transfer point where you see ships and trains that come together. This is up in Buffalo. Here you see the mobile grain elevators. This is called the marine leg right here. There's the spout for loading. And you see freight cars. And on this side, you can actually see some more warehouses and trains, tugboats, all kinds of cool stuff. This is down in New Orleans. We have rails going up to a marine grain terminal. Can't really see the ship in this picture, but there would be a ship right behind this. And New Orleans had these interesting transloading facilities that would take grain off of ships, and, or in this case, they're taking it off the barge, going up the marine leg into this little tower, and then load it onto the ship. So lots of opportunities for cool models. This is in Chicago, fairly recent. You can see the marine leg there. And these aren't that old, the boxcars. They're pretty recent. They're probably 30s or 40s era. Baltimore had a couple of these, although these are pretty much gone now. This was the old Pennsy grain elevator in Canton. It had a great big yard that supported it. The trains would actually be switched into this facility where the boxcars would literally be tipped over and unloaded from the sides of the doors. And there was another one down here up in the New Jersey side of New York Harbor. What's happened to the East Coast grain elevators, they've all pretty much disappeared, and they've been replaced by grain elevators on the Mississippi. And this is an example of one. This is at Beaumont, Texas. And I like this one because the switching of the elevator is done in short cuts. They don't have a balloon track for their elevator. So these little switch engines are bringing in 4 or 5 cars at a time through the unloading shed and then pulling back out and bringing new ones. And you can see the ship there. There's your scenic element. There's also these grain elevators on the West Coast. This is at Portland. And this is one of the more famous grain elevators because it does have a loop track that goes right around it. And if you look through the steel work here, you will see a BNSF engine coming through. And this is another view of it. Here's a mainline train coming down, and this is the loop track that goes around. This would be about a 15-inch radius in HO scale if you ever wanted to model this. There's a track plan for it in my book, I believe. And the pictures, these picture up here and this picture here, I took from standing on this bridge and looking north. Another area where we see trains and boats come together are the mineral terminals on the Great Lakes and on the coast of Florida, where they export a lot of phosphate. I have never seen anyone model these facilities. I think it would be really cool, particularly if you did it back in an older era where the ships weren't quite so big. That would be tough to model a big loop like that. Iron ore docks, people know about these. Walters did a kit of them, but they're pretty big. They can be pretty massive. Look at that dock dwarfs that ship. And there were other forms. There weren't just those gravity loaders. This is a brown hoist unloader with a whale back ship. These were interesting ships. They were very strong, but their drawback was they couldn't be readily expanded. And as the ships got bigger and bigger, there was no way to cut these in half and make them bigger, and so they were quickly obsolete. But another example of tracks right up alongside the ship. And in Baltimore, we still have ships coming in. Unfortunately, they got rid of the tracks on this pier, and the day I was there, they were unloading road salt into dump trucks, and then the dump trucks were taking it over here. But there used to be tracks on that in older times. Hewlett unloaders, another example of where the tracks come right up to the pier. You can see a hopper car tucked in there. Walters made a model of these things, so people are familiar with them, but they're just another great example of that interface. And now a lot of these boats will do self-unloading, which may or may not have tracks, so they may not be as viable for the point I'm trying to make today. But we do have other coal unloaders that existed. Most of these are now obsolete. However, I'm going to show you a little video clip here. This guy took a great drone video of the ore unloader in Sandusky, I believe it was. And if you want to find these videos, it's called NKY Railfan on YouTube. And he'll take you through the whole evolution of loading this ship up and shipping it out. This is an older ship. I forget the name of it, but it's an 81-year-old bulk carrier. All right, so let's skip that. We'll move on to the Norfolk Southern coal pier. Now, one of the things that you find with coal these days is there's two different philosophies for having the trains unload the coal. The Norfolk Southern uses this big device. This, at one point in time, was the largest moving machine in the world. It's not true anymore. I think the Space Shuttle launch pad has taken that record. But what they do is they store the different grades of coal right in the hoppers. And so when a customer orders coal, they will blend the coal based on what's available in the hoppers in the yard. Now, across the harbor, CSX doesn't do it that way. CSX unloads the coal to piles in the middle of a loop. And then as the ships come in to get loaded, they will transfer it out onto the ship using these bucket wheel reclaimers, which there's some of these in Baltimore too. They're very cool structures. And Revell actually made a model of one of these. It was just under N scale. And I had one, but I never used it. So I ended up selling it to Bob Gallegos, who used to work for Walters. But this is a cool machine because it can drop the coal on the ground, and then they can reverse it, turn the buckets on. Actually, I guess they'd go that way, and they would send the coal back. So they're called stacker reclaimers. And here's the example of it up in Baltimore. And you can see the ship down here waiting to be loaded. Before 9/11, I actually drove my car all the way down here and got pictures of this. A security guard did ask me what I was doing, and I told him I was taking pictures. He said, okay, follow me. And he took me around, and I got lots of great pictures of this thing. Now it's all blocked off back up here. Can't get there anymore. These coal loops, by the way, are not just on the Atlantic side. They're also up and down the Mississippi River. Here's an example of one in Duluth, and you'll find them either coal loops or grain loops up and down the Mississippi. All right, so we'll switch now to railroad ferries. This is another place where trains get right on the boats. These make compelling models. Check out this one by Thomas Ruber took the photo. It's actually a team of fellows that built this ferry. And it was at one point considered the largest railroad ferry in the world. And it worked up here in the, well, that one didn't. That one is at a different location on the California coast. But here we see other railroad ferries, because the only railroad that could get into San Francisco from the south, from the land, I believe was the, let's see, was it the SP? Anyway, I can't remember. I'll have to look that up. So all the other railroads that wanted to get into San Francisco had to come by barge and pier. Now, these are passenger ones, I think. But Pliny Holt made a really nice model of this. He's since passed away, but he was a great modeler in N scale, and I took pictures of his layout at one point. And in the Michigan area, you had these really awesome car ferries that were self-propelled, but they look like barges. But if you look underneath, you can see that, yes, indeed, they did have their own motors. And they were really cool. This one is on the New Orleans area. And I think it's probably the coolest name for a railroad. Morgan's Louisiana and Texas Railroad and Steamship Company, which eventually was merged into the Southern Pacific. And this is a ferry that's carrying rail cars. And I thought this is a neat feature right here, where the cars connect to the ferry using their couplers so that they don't roll off. Other railroad ferries, Pierre Marquette's that the C&O used to do up in Lake Michigan. They would go from Michigan to Wisconsin, avoiding Chicago. And Chicago back then would be like a week delay to get a freight car through Chicago. So even though this was more expensive, you would save money by shipping them across the lake. And there were different styles. This one, the Turtle Line, was one of the few that had it had a strange arrangement on its propeller. So this was way up by the Straits of Mackinac. And it was running until the 1980s, which was kind of interesting. And the Ann Arbor Railroad was another one of these. They had their own fleet of car ferries. They came out of Frankfurt and then they fanned out to different locations. And there was a guy, Art Gerritsen, who also unfortunately has passed away. And I visited his railroad a couple of years ago, and I got to operate this yard and switch the cars into the car ferries. He had numerous models of these things. It was one of the nicest railroads that not too many people have heard about. He was an MR once, but it really was a well-conceived railroad. This one is kind of interesting. This is the sea train, where they actually loaded railroad cars right onto the ship using this unusual elevator arrangement. And initially they would go from Texas to New York, but they also went from Texas and New York to some of the Caribbean ports. And there's an interesting anecdote about this ship. In World War II, during the Battle of El Alamein, the United States sent a convoy to Egypt with all kinds of equipment. And the ship that was carrying the Sherman tanks, which were the hot tank at the time, was torpedoed and sank. And so the United States said, okay, we are going to send you more tanks. You know, the old Doritos commercial, eat all you want, we'll make more. So they said, the Texas, you're going to go by yourself. We're going to load you with tanks, going to go around the tip of Africa, come up by Ethiopia and get up to Egypt and do total radio silence, no convoy, and just outrun anybody you run into. And they did that, except right off of Ethiopia, an Italian submarine almost intercepted them. But anyway, they got through, they delivered the tanks to Montgomery's army, and the Battle of Maine was won. So, interesting anecdote about this ship. And there still are ferries like this that are operating. This is one that goes from, it changed its location. It used to be in New Orleans, and then it moved to Mobile, and then it tried to move back, and I'm not even sure where it is anymore. It was in the news recently. It had to do with drug importation and some other things. So I heard about it recently. But it's probably a bigger project than somebody would want to take, maybe would work in N scale. But you can see that you load your cars on 2 decks, and you had this interesting elevated structure to load them up. Now, car floats are what everybody thinks about when they think about ships and marine, and they are very compelling. This is a photo of one down on Chesapeake that Paul took. But this was the first railroad car ferry, and this is the one that I model on my railroad. These scenes show it in Alexandria, and I model the other end of the line down at the Quiet Landing. This is a model of the Alexandria car ferry that I built for the Lyceum. This is still at the Lyceum if you want to see it. This was actually way before I ever built my Civil War railroad, and so I probably would do things a little differently if I did it again. And then these kind of car ferries were running fairly late. This one in Chesapeake ran not too long ago that it stopped. And the one in New York, I believe, is still running. This picture here is for Roger. I thought Roger would be online today. This is the car float operation that he's modeling down in Norfolk. The CNO had an isolated yard. It is actually one of my favorite locations. This whole thing could be modeled 1-to-1 at about 16 feet. And the ships would pull in here. This is the car ferry down here. The car ferry had a smokestack, but it wasn't self-powered. The smokestack was just to provide steerage. And this is a good one. I'm waiting to see somebody model this. Now, lots of people have modeled this area, but not too many people model the tracks going into the water. And I don't know how you would do that, but that would be a challenging modeling project. I'd like to see somebody do that. If you're really looking for a bite-size or pint-size little car ferry operation, this one on Lake Okanagan in British Columbia would be a good one. The only drawback is this was their motive power. That's got to be one of the funkiest looking switch engines I've seen in a while. But this was in May of a 68 model railroader if you want to look it up and get some more info. Now, New York is a special case because they're just so massive. You had 150 railroad tugs, 300 floats, 1,000 barges, thousands of employees, and they were just shifting. It's hard to believe now, but from, say, the Civil War till about the 1950s, New York was a major industrial city. This whole area was just factories, the Navy Yard where they made all the Liberty ships, well, not all of them, but they made a lot of Liberty ships. And even when I was a kid in the 50s and 60s, this area was still heavy maritime industry. My uncle was a merchant mariner, and I actually sat on a Trans-Colorado, which was a converted Victory ship. I actually spent the night on the ship one time. And so lots of activity going on down there. And these are pictures from about the, say, 1920s or so, maybe a little earlier. And this is the East River down here. And my dad grew up in New York City. And he told me that they would jump in, they would take the train up to Harlem area, walk over to the river, jump in the river, and swim down the river. The current was really fast. So the current would pull them down, and then they would get out somewhere in downtown. With all these boats and stuff going on. Can you imagine that? With the helicopter parents these days, that would never happen. But he survived, and I guess he's tougher for it. But look at the juxtaposition again of sail, steam. You got a tug pulling a big barge. This operation here, really cool. I think more people should model this era. I think it's just so interesting. And there were lots of different types of floats in New York. And there's some shown there at the bottom. Models of these exist, although the company that made this just shut down, I believe, what, 2 weeks ago? The owner shut it down, or he died. I don't remember the exact details. These self-propelled floating grain elevators, there were some models done by that fellow up in New York. He passed away too. Parisi, I think his name was. He made some really nice models of these. And again, just compelling models. And there's still a car ferry operating up there. Goes from Brooklyn over to a place in New Jersey. I'm not sure how busy it is anymore, but it's still operating. And we have lots of people that built these car floats. Walters made the float available and the tugboats. This is on Paul's layout. This was a layout I visited in Portland area where he modeled that Slocum Lake thing that I mentioned earlier. But to get from one level of the layout to the other via car ferry, he had this actuator that raised and lowered it. I thought that was very clever. And here we see Vince Lee's little terminal that he made. Very cute little thing. It's probably only 8 feet across. This is Tim Morris's famous car ferry operation, Pocket Terminal in Bronx, New York. Mike Prokop has this one. It's a coal thing in Camden, New Jersey. Again, not too big. He's got the barge and the tugboat down here. This was one that I saw in, was this Portland? Yeah, this might have been Portland too. This is an N scale one where they remove the ferry, they connect the cars by their couplers, and then when they're done, they just pull the ferry out and replace it with another one. And this is the car ferry on my current railroad. This is the Pile line. So this is the one that would interface with Alexandria. And I don't have any pictures of what this ramp actually looked like. So I just copied the one that was in Alexandria. I figured maybe that's what it looked like. But unfortunately, I never got a picture of that. I mentioned barges earlier. Barges are sort of the unsung heroes of American transportation. They have tremendous capacity. This little diagram compares what one barge with one tug, which is called a typical tow, it's equal to 2.5 unit trains or 870 tractor trailers. So with a crew of about 5 people, you can haul a lot of stuff. Oh, this picture, by the way, is at Winifred, West Virginia, where they are taking coal and loading it onto barges for transport on, well, this is the Kanawha River up here, but it becomes the Ohio River eventually. And here's some other pictures. Take some fancy navigation to maneuver these big barges. This is down the Tennessee River. This is the Ohio River in Evanston. That's what a loading facility looks like. And this is down at West Point, Virginia, where the Mattapony River is. And here you're bringing in loads of wood chips for use at the paper mill there. Now, containers are what's kind of replaced all the break bulk carrier, and they've revolutionized the shipping industry. It was invented by Malcolm McLean, pretty much. There were containers in World War II. They called them connexes, but there was no real way to get those things commercially loaded. And what the innovation this guy came up with, a couple innovations. He came up with the interlocking plugs for the corners of the containers, but he also came up with the business concept of having the trucks bring the cargo to the containers. And so it was really more of a business problem than a technology problem. And his early container ships were converted oil tankers. And so there was oil at the bottom of this ship, and they just put some containers on the top. The idea being, well, if the container idea doesn't pan out, then we can always go back to being a tanker. But eventually they did convert these C2 ships from World War II into cellular container ships. This would be the first one. That's a reasonable size for a model. So if you're in a 60s era modeler, that would be a good ship that you might want to do. And here's an example of early container operations in Seattle. I don't know the exact date of this picture, but it's probably in the 60s sometime. You judge by the cars down there. And then in 2015, we see container flow is basically dominating traffic. But if you'll notice, and by the way, this is a chart that I actually did for Congressional Budget Office when I worked for them. I did a study on scanning containers for nuclear weapons, and we assembled this chart from the data that the customs people gave us. And you can see Asia, particularly China, is the greatest percentage of the cargo. And this showed the distribution. Some Chinese cargo and Asian cargo did come up through the Panama Canal. And not so much from Europe and Asia this way. The main operation is on this side. This is the second largest container terminal on the East Coast, but now what's missing from our perspective as model railroaders, there's no trains in this picture. This is a bummer. New Orleans, you do see some tracks along the pier, but they don't really use them. The rail container operation takes place back here, and this was done with wheeled vehicles or even other automated vehicles to get them to the ships. This are photos of what these are wheeled little vehicles that are being used to haul containers around. That's a little video I shot in California. That's a front loader. The interesting thing about that video is those green containers are domestic, United States domestic containers. They can't be used in international travel because they are too big. So they're not shipped over here on container ships. They're shipped over here on break bulk ships, and they're used only on American highways and railroads. I think it's ironic that the containers that can only be used in America are built overseas and shipped here. Anyway, container ships are interesting boats or ships. I guess I shouldn't say boats. Sorry, Navy guys. And here you look on this little comparison. So there's 3 GP9s. And here we see the first container ship. This is what we would call a feeder container ship. So these are ideal for model railroads because when you start getting to the big ocean carrying ones, they're just massive. And this is a medium-sized one. They got the Panamax here, which is the largest container ship that can go through the old Panama Canal. This one can't. These ships actually don't really come to the United States very much. They do mostly Asia to Europe. That's where the biggest container ships sail. And now with the Red Sea being all messed up, they're actually all sailing around Africa. They're not going through the Suez Canal anymore. Here you got a Nimitz carrier down here for comparison. These things make aircraft carriers look small. And we have the dolly. Oh, wait a minute, that's the wrong dolly bridge thing. This gives you an example of the dolly. I hit the Key Bridge a couple of weeks ago, and the ship weighed more than the bridge. That's pretty impressive. They're getting ready to blow this tomorrow, I believe. They're going to make all the cuts. They can't remove this section of the bridge without damaging the boat or injuring people because they're afraid it'll tip over. So they're going to make a bunch of cuts up and down this bridge, set them off all at once, and all the little pieces of steel, well, all the large pieces of steel, will fall into the water, hopefully not hurting anybody, and then they can pick them up with their crane and hopefully get that ship out of the way. Here's some container cranes, early ones. This was the first container crane, first dedicated container crane in the United States with the A-frame structure, and lots of them were evolved later. This one used to be at Canton, and in the old days, you could just walk underneath it, take pictures, which I did do at one point. Now you can't do that anymore. Here are the really big ones. These are the latest ones they brought into, let me think, is this Baltimore? No, this isn't Baltimore, but they did bring a bunch of these into Baltimore. They're even bigger than the ones they had. At one point, I got a ride up one of these containers, and they took me out, and there was no ship there. And I'm not super afraid of heights, but I also don't like hanging off the water 150 feet or whatever I was in the air. It was kind of interesting. Yeah, this is the one that I got the ride up. So they took me up here, they lowered the thing down, and we went out. So this is Baltimore right here, but in this picture, you can just barely see in this corner the new ones that can service bigger ships, like the Dolly, are in there. This is up at Tacoma. I took this picture in Tacoma, and this is down in Los Angeles, where there are dozens and dozens of these cranes. So what do? The ships, these container ships are really too big for effective modeling. I mean, you could try doing a Panamax ship in HO scale. This is N, HO, and O. And, O, yeah, it's probably not going to work. That would be 20-some feet long there. But in N and HO, it's reasonable to get a ship. But what you do is you pick a terminal that's small. So you can model this whole thing in 20 feet. This is the Port of Palm Beach. This is the FEC main line down here. And they have a spur that comes off, a little yard, and then lots of industries. They do their container switching right down in there. They have smaller container ships. You can see one there. And this is primarily for cargo that's going to the Caribbean. They also have a cement facility here. And this thing is actually a power plant that burns oil. It doesn't really do rail stuff. This particular facility contains molasses. Well, let me rephrase that. It contains sugar for molasses. And the day we went there, my wife was with me, and they had a security guy take us around, and they had a new woman who was going to be their public affairs officer. So she went with us to learn the harbor. And they took us into the door of this thing, and we got out, and my wife walked inside, and the other lady walked inside, and I kind of stood outside taking pictures. And when they came back, their shoes were all sticky because the sugar it kind of dissolves and makes like gooey goop on the bottom. And my wife said, I'm never eating candy again. Because that sugar from this facility, I believe they said it goes up to Baltimore. Anyway, here's some other close-up pictures of it. This little video I shot from the bridge shows how a lot of the container things work, shuffling the containers around. But you can see very compact container terminal, little cuts of five well cars at one time. So if you like to do containers, this would be a neat little port to model. Here's pictures of their motive power. This is a close-up of the gantry that loads the sugar, but behind it is a power plant. And there are models of these container cranes available, although these are all scratch built in these images. This was a modular layout that I saw in Atlanta. This was the first one I built. It was a highly compressed version of this. I built this one for an actual container operator in New Jersey who wanted a model of a container crane. He didn't operate this crane, but he said that was okay. He just wanted one for his house. So I actually built that for a guy up in New Jersey who works for the New York Container Terminal, which is on the Staten Island side, I believe. So now let's talk about ships. And when you think of ship models, you may think of this, right? But this is not what we're talking about. This would take years to build on your own. I mean, this is a very complex model. What we're talking about are ships like this. And I'll describe some of the features, but notice flat sides, parallel mid-body with just some curvature on the front and bow, or stern and bow. And I actually scratch built these containers. And I would like to point out that this model, I'll show you a little bit more later, was actually a fiberglass hull. It was a kit that I bought from a company called D's Marine, but I ended up scratch building the whole top. And it only really took me about 3 weeks to build this. It's not much different than building any other structure. I mean, this is a square structure, easy to whip the styrene parts. These were photo etch railings that I purchased. You had to build them up, but it's okay. And that part I made on my laser. The windmill blades I got from a supplier. I did have to scratch build these cranes, but it really wasn't that bad. So that's what we're talking about. So the easiest way to put a ship on your railroad is to put a picture of it on the backdrop or to paint it on the backdrop. This is a painting on my current railroad. It took me 1 night to paint this. It wasn't that hard. But if you do want to build a model ship, you're going to run into one little problem. That's the model railroad scales, which are in red, don't necessarily correlate to the ship model scales shown in white. The sweet spot really is S. The problem with S scale is almost all the ship models that are in S scale are sailing ships and old ones before railroads came out. There are some O scale ships. And there actually are some HO ones, which I'll show you in a minute. So this is on my railroad. This is an O scale model Smuggler. It's like an 1870s era sailboat, but I talked with the people at the Blue Jacket Models Museum, and they said, yeah, this is typical of the type of hull and hardware you would see on a ship back then. By the way, I started building this. My brother helped a little bit with the hull, and then Brian Boyles finished the top for me. He did a nice job on it. Took him 18 months though. So let's look at what ships are available and what scales. And this isn't exhaustive, but I've been looking at this for a long time, and this gives you a pretty good feel. So if you're an HO, you actually have a fairly good number of model companies that support you. And this new one here is Turk Model. This is one of Turk Model's kits. This is a British tramp steamer that was used by the Turkish Navy or the Turkish Merchant Marine. But this would be perfect for use in any ship from, say, the 1970s to about the 1900s. I mean, that fits a wide range of scales. You just chop off the bottom. It is a plank and frame hull, which I'll talk about in a little bit. It's a little harder to build. Over here, if you look at 196 scale, you have a lot of kits available. D's Marine, Fleet Scale, Cottage Industries. These are mostly old sailboats, Civil War era, and even Lindbergh makes some. There are a few oddball models like this Revell tugboat. That's like, they claim it's 104th scale. There are a lot of ship models in 192nd, but that's starting to get a little too small, maybe suitable for N scale. And like I said, there are several in O scale. And I don't know of any in this scale other than tugboats are available in that scale. So I've mentioned this term a couple times. What is a waterline model? Well, it's a ship that's simulating that it's in the water. And what this does for you is it gets rid of all the complicated curves that are at the bottom of a ship. You're going to cut it off right at the waterline or maybe slightly higher, depending if the ship's empty or not. And so what you end up with is ships with relatively flat sides. Okay, there's a pointy stern and a pointy bow, but you're going to have to do a little bit of modeling to do that. And when you build a hull, the techniques for sail, steam, diesel are pretty much the same. And what are those techniques? Well, there's several. The first one is the most complicated, is called plank on frame. Now, when ship modelers tell you it's a plank on frame model, watch out, because that is a very complex model, because they are modeling every frame that was in the actual ship. So if you look at this example of a plank on frame, this schooner had those planks in those locations, or correction, frames in those locations, and then it was planked over. But there's also a type of ship called plank on bulkhead, which simplifies everything by giving you nowadays laser cut pieces that skip several frames. So you don't have to build every frame, and then you just fill this area in with planks. And this is an example of a plank on frame steamboat that I built for my old traveling Civil War railroad. This was, I cut these on my laser based on some plans, but I didn't plank it because I wanted people to see, well, it's supposed to be a ship under construction, but you could see the actual frames. I still have that now. I don't know what to do with it. The next one you can do is a fiberglass hull. This is if you buy like a radio control kit, they will probably come with a fiberglass hull. Not all of them do, but some of them do. And so here you see me, because I'm cutting fiberglass with a motor tool. I was doing it outside and I was wearing my mask because I didn't want to breathe that dust. But I put masking tape on the fiberglass hull and I just cut away the bottom, the water line. And then the kit came with these styrene parts, but I ended up scratch building the whole thing using my laser. It made it a lot easier. But you could cut this out with a knife and use the parts they give you. So that simplified that ship quite a bit. There are people who build plank on bulkhead models in styrene, but this is actually a lot harder than it looks. And the reason for it is illustrated by this thing called shell expansion diagram. So when you build a steel ship, the plates can't stretch. So the engineers that design these ships, they have to draw what the steel plate looks like in 2 dimensions. And then it goes to rollers where it's formed and then fitted to the ship with rivets or welding. But if you're doing a styrene model, you kind of have to know this information because you can't stretch the styrene pieces. So you would probably do it piece by piece because getting a shell expansion diagram is a big job if you don't already have it. So that's why you don't see too many styrene ships like this. This is one of the oldest and easiest ways to do it is you take a solid block of wood, you put the side profile and the plan view from on the top, and you cut it on a bandsaw or a handsaw, and then you just sand it to the final shape. A modified technique is what they call bread and butter, where you take the plans that come with the ship, and if you go back, you'll see that these ships come with these plans here. And so you can take all the sections, cut those out on thin pieces of wood. This really is useful for large models where you don't want to have a massive block of wood. And then you build up the layers of bread and butter. And the benefit of this is that it's less prone to warping. If you made a big model with a solid block of wood, the hull could warp as it dries. And this is a little example of a bread and butter hull I made for an N-scale Pungy schooner. And here you can see on my laser, I cut the little layers out of basswood and then built the hull up that way, sanded it down until it was appropriate, and then stuck the mass and things on it. Here's a modified technique where my brother's wood shop, I didn't have a bandsaw at the time, I have one now, but we used my brother's bandsaw to do a bread and butter model of a 5-foot long bulk carrier, which is actually sitting up there. I never finished it. And we used poplar wood. And so here you see the parallel mid-body, which is just 2 pieces of poplar, and then the rest of the bread and butter parts. And I used my sanders to sand those down and get the right profile. Never finished this boat because I sold that layout that it was going to go on. I have no place to put it anymore. So now I'm going to take you through a little case study of how I built a tugboat, because I think this type of boat or ship is appropriate for just about any layout that has water, because tugboats are everywhere. And in this particular style of tugboat was common from the Civil War time when the first screw propellers came out. So back here it has a screw, it doesn't have a paddle wheel, although you can see a paddle wheel in the background. And they lasted until about the 1930s. So this is appropriate for a lot of different railroads. These are Civil War pictures you'll get here. And one complication was I got COVID couple of years ago. And I wasn't really sick, but I couldn't go anywhere. So I stayed home and I built this ship. So I took the photographs and I converted the photographs into these drawings, which I'm going to either laser cut or cut on my bandsaw. So that was my set of plans I generated. And one thing you got to remember about ships is they're not almost never flat. They have camber, which is like the camber of a road. And this is so the water that splashes on the deck can flow off. And they have shear. Okay, and shear is more hydrodynamic reasons, but this line describes better what shear is and better I can say it. So they kind of dip in the middle. All right, so when you build a ship model, you can't just use a flat slab of wood most of the time. So the way I accomplished that on this tugboat was I made the plans, I pasted them on this block of balsa, or correction, basswood, and I cut them on my bandsaw. So here you can see I'm cutting the shear on this line, and now I'm cutting the overhead view, but because the bottom is flat, it worked perfectly on my bandsaw. And then I used my power sanders to just sand them down to the final profiles. So really it wasn't that complicated. And then to add the camber in, I made these little pieces on my laser that had the camber line, and then I just planked over it, and that gave me my camber. And then laid in the gunnels here with the stanchions. Tugboats have this grating on the back, which I added in. You can see I just used little paper clips to glue those on. Notice a flat bottom because this is a waterline model. And then to make the deck house, it was basically like any other structure, except it had a slight camber in here. And the way, if say you don't get that curve just right, you put a piece of sandpaper on your camber and you just sand it back and forth until it matches perfectly. And that's what I did on this model. To make the details, I used my 3D printer. I have a horn down here. These are little grappling hooks. I don't know, maybe they were anchors. The smokestack, and these are not appropriate for the Civil War, but I just wanted to put one in there anyway, so I put one. These came out, I think they're called the Chanwells or something. In the Civil War, they just used a speaking tube. They just talked on a tube and they would listen in the engine. This came out later, but it's so cool. Excuse me. And so there's the finished model sitting on my railroad. And I named it the Atlantic because that was the tug that hauled the car ferry on my railroad. So that was cool. Now, say you really don't want to build a ship model. There are custom builders that will build models for you. This particular company called Model Ship Master, they actually had this as an inventory item. I mean, when I say inventory, a custom model that they build to spec, but it was available. I think they said it was $4,000, but it could be more now because that was several years ago. And you can see the woman here gives you a sense of scale. This is an HO model. They use HO containers to scale it. However, I found this company in South Africa called the Model Shipyard. They're a shipbuilding facility, or model shipbuilding facility at a maritime museum in South Africa. And they offered this Baltimore Clipper at a fairly reasonable price. And I custom ordered it from them, and I told them waterline, and I showed them how I wanted the sails done. And sure enough, I mean, this is the example. This is the ship, the type of ship I'm trying to recreate, which is basically a topsail schooner. Whether or not it was a clipper or not, probably wasn't a clipper by the time of the Civil War. There were very few Baltimore clippers left by the Civil War, but there were some. And I have another picture of one in Aquia Landing. And so here they sent me in progress photos of them working on it, showing that they made the waterline hull. There were some pictures of the guy. I thought it was really cool. This company said they hired women from an African tribe who were known for small hands, so they could tie the knots on these sailing ships. However, the person who built my ship model was, or the men, it was men, it wasn't women. So at least that's what they show me in the pictures. And lo and behold, 3 months later, this thing showed up in my house. Perfectly fine, no damage. Beautiful model. So it's now, see, that's my wife looking at it, so you get a sense of the size. And now it's sitting on my railroad. I just need to weather it up a little bit. Notice how they put the sails onto my spec, because that's how they did it in the Civil War. They didn't, other long story, I won't go into it. All right, so one of the things I'm trying to do on my railroad is create that forest of mast effects. And to do that, I need to have ships, lots of ships next to each other. And so I have the ones painted on the backdrop, and then I will eventually put another ship at the second wharf, which is Burnside Wharf. And then I'll have multiple ships on this wharf. And I hope I can achieve that effect of the forest of masts that I call it. All right, we're almost done. Let's look at a gallery of ship models that other people have done. This was on Doug Tagsold's 2 layouts ago. Doug Tagsold is the only guy I know who builds layouts faster than me. And he builds layouts, man. He builds beautiful layouts. Anyway, I think this is a scratch build. It doesn't look like a kit to me. The railings don't look like any railing kit, but I could be wrong on that. I forgot to ask Doug about it. And here's a little video clip of a coal train going by. His little coal loader thing here doesn't work. It's just for show. And I don't even think he had tracks. You can see he never really finished the tracks below it. He got rid of this layout, by the way. He's now modeling narrow gauge in his own scale. He took HO engines and made them into narrow gauge, and it's like 1/76 or second scale, something like that. These are other scenes on his old Toledo layout. I think I operated it once. It was a lot of fun. And he had this ship model, I believe, comes from Sylvan, and I'm not sure about that one. I believe this one might be the Walters kit, but I could be wrong about that. Ken Larson up in Maryland. I just saw him a couple months ago after not seeing him for years. I think he scratch built this one, but I'm not sure. Ken, if you're listening, let me know. But it's a great scene, and he has something very clever. This water is a piece of cellophane. So the aisle is over here. And so when he wants to take pictures, he pulls the cellophane tight and takes his pictures and then lets it drop when he's done with it. I thought that was very clever. Now you can do it in Photoshop, but anyway, back then. Jim Dahlberg has built an interesting rail to barge operation, modeling that one I showed you earlier. Here are some examples of ship models. Oh, this is Matt Thompson's. This is a kit from Architect in the Netherlands. They make several HO scale ship models. This one down here is by Harold Lloyd. This is a conversion of a Dean's Marine kit. It's a Liberty ship, but Harold had to do a lot of work on it. And Doug tells me that he spent 1,600 hours on this, which I find incomprehensible why it took so long. But he probably is a very fastidious, slow worker. Gorgeous model, though. And then this one here is what they call a bunker barge. Excuse me. This is the type of vessel that gets loaded with fuel, which they call bunker for ships, and then it goes out to the ship and fuels up the ship. This is a slab of acetate, or acrylic, I mean, that I laser cut and then just built up. This probably took 2 days to build. This was my first container ship. This is an N-scale container ship, so these are N-scale containers. That's a poplar plank. I didn't have a laser back then, so I had cut all these parts, and this is about 18 inches long, I believe. These fellows built these nice harbor scene with lots of ships. This is actually a kit that was available, might still be available, but they scratch built this one, and they were French people modeling an American port. And speaking of French people, there's a group, if you click on this down here, you can go to their forum where there's several modelers. Most of them are French, and they're doing just a wonderful job of modeling these rail marine interface in America. And this is Christopher LaCour's models right here. Andrew Brown lives in the UK, and he takes this to exhibitions. And you know, in England or UK, when you exhibit a railroad, you actually get paid to bring your railroad. But they expect you to have a good railroad, and they expect you to operate it. And so what he does is he switches the ships around as he goes to different shows to keep it fresh and new. So there's another picture of his setup with some different ships. And I believe this is a Sylvan kit back here. I'm not sure where this might have been one of the American model builders. Troels Kirk was in Sweden. He built a really neat narrow gauge railroad. Unfortunately, this railroad has disappeared from the face of the internet. And I don't know, I know he started concentrating on his traditional two-dimensional art. He was a painter, but he had this really wonderful layout in a shed in his backyard. And he scratch built these particular ships that you're looking at. He also has some sailing ship kits that he built. So there's a scratch-built lumber carrier. This is on Matt Thompson's old railroad. I don't know if this survived for Matt's new railroad, but that was, I believe, the Sylvan kit. And I'm not sure, probably the Walters tugboat. That's HO scale. This was the Cal Winters layout. It was built by a professional organization. And Paul Dolkus told me that this was the most impressive layout he had seen of all the layouts he ever visited. So it must have been something. I've never been there. Paul took these pictures. But we have a scratch-built car ferry that went from Key West to Havana on the FEC. Jeff Otto's layout in Minnesota is just amazing. It's huge, first of all. And it is the most flawless running railroad given the intensity of the operations. And I operated there once, and my job was just harbor master. I just had to keep track of all the boats and trains that were coming in, and I spent the morning doing that. And then he said, "Oh, you need a break. Go run a little town somewhere." So I got to switch a town, but that was an experience. And these, I believe, are just the Walters kits that he's just tried to make look as accurate as possible, particularly with regard to the size. There's another view of it. So this whole area up here is the harbor of Duluth, I believe. This was an early N-scale thing that I built. This was my old house. That's the PRR elevator at Canton. And then that was my first scratch-built container crane, which I scaled down to fit. And here you see me cheating. This is a poster that I got of a container ship. And so that's just a 2D print stuck on the wall. And these containers were made with cardboard. Here's more of Howard Lloyd's work. Fantastic modeler. I don't remember if this is his current layout or the one before it, but he scratch built. This is an older style bunker barge, self-propelled. That's a neat looking model. And he's got some great stuff on his railroad. These guys probably take the cake though. They're called Montforge Model Spore, which means modeling. Montforge is their name of, there were three brothers and one other guy. And the other guy, I think, is the one who scratch builds the ships. So just about everything you see in here is scratch built. Here's an example of a scratch built container ship that they were working on. Also, here's scratch built harbor cranes. Just some amazing modeling, really cool. And this is some other work. They have various iterations that they can take to different shows. This to me looks like the Dean's Marine kit down here. So to wrap it up, I want to show you a little video clip on my old port layout, which I no longer have. Tom Pierpoint bought the layout, but he didn't buy the ships. So I still have some of this stuff. They're actually sitting right next to me. And let's just watch this little video and get a feel for how you can add ships to your model railroad. I'm not hearing the sound. I don't know why. Can you guys hear any sound? Well, I can barely hear it. So that was a grade crossing kit. The reason I added that grade crossing was for the NMRA Master Modeler, you had to have an electronic thing. So that was my electronic thing because I didn't really have one on my Civil War railroad. Unfortunately, I'm not hearing the sound, so I don't know why that's not working. But that layout was 19 by 12. But we could switch pretty long cuts of cars on there. So I think this might be 12 cars here. I think 18 cars was the limit of the siding. And I selected this railroad because it's the port of Los Angeles, which is a big container port. But this particular pier or peninsula in the harbor was mostly break bulk cargo and borax. And they had an oil terminal nearby too. And they had, now I hear the sound. Here we have a little trackmobile. And if the ground is level and the tracks are straight, that little trackmobile can haul a fair good number of cars. Right, and then one last, I think there's a couple more scenes here. The other cool thing, remember I said at the beginning that I was inspired by those big BNSF engines coming right down to the ships. And so here's my attempt to replicate that. We have GP60s. These were given to me by Matt Gudinski. And it turns out that they really didn't operate the GP60s down at the harbor. So technically it's a FUBU, but they look cool and they run great. And these are some of the new Atlas cars. In fact, I just got these the day I took this video, so they hadn't really been weathered. And finally, I did have lights on buildings, and so I was able to shoot this one little night scene, and I think it came out really cool. Unfortunately, I'm not hearing the locomotive. I don't know why. The sound needs some work. By the way, this video is on my YouTube channel. So if you want to see it again with the sound, you can go to my YouTube channel. All right, so a lot of the stuff I covered today is amplified and reinforced in my book by Kalmbach. This book is still available for sale. And so go ahead and pick it up before it goes out of print. Two of my other books are now out of print. And I like to mention I do have some other books. These two are now out of print, but these two are still available. All right, so thank you for your attention and let me know if you have any questions.